South Korea is widely known as one of the most economically successful countries in the world. With high-tech industries and global brands that make products sold all around the world, over the past decades, it became a true economic powerhouse. But now, despite all the global success of its legacy brands, it looks like South Korea's economic model is increasingly running out of steam. Its economic growth has been gradually slowing for years, and today it has basically stopped. And no one, including South Korea itself, expects that the economy should start growing again anytime soon. So how come that even with all of South Korea's global high-tech brands, is the economy hitting a wall? How could South Korea turn this around, and why does it seem unable to do that? This is the end of South Korea's economic miracle. For a long time, the South Korean economy knew nothing but growth. Starting in the 1950s, the economy grew at a lightning pace for nearly 3 decades, with growth rates still exceeding 10% per year, even as late as the 1980s. And even though growth eventually began to slow, there was little cause for concern, as South Korea remained wealthy and it continued to grow, averaging 7% GDP growth in the 1990s, 4% in the 2000s, and 3% in the 2010s. But over the past 5 years, growth has continued to slow down year by year. And the real problem here isn't just that the growth has slowed down. After all, this happens to all economies at some point as they get richer. Instead, the concern is that this slowdown might not be a temporary slump, but rather the new normal. As even the Bank of Korea has publicly warned that the economy may see no growth at all in the next decade, and it is likely to begin to shrink by the 2040s. In other words, there is a widespread and well-founded worry that South Korea's economy may have finally exhausted the secret sauce that fueled its growth for so long, and that from now on, the country is on a declining trajectory, where, unless things change, every decade will be worse than the one before, and every generation will be worse off than their parents. But how is that possible if South Korea designs, builds, and sells so many high-tech products that are successful all over the world and that you very likely have at home as well, from phones to cars, electronics, and so much else? Well, this paradox does have an explanation, but it requires us to peel back a few layers to look at how the Korean economic model actually came to be and how it operates to this day, because the reality is a little less glamorous than how it's usually sold. You might have heard that the core of the South Korean economy is made up of so-called chaebols, ginormous monopolistic Korean corporations usually owned and operated by several dynastic families that have for generations received privileged support from the state in form of tax breaks, subsidies, and generally not having to play by the same rules as everyone else. Thanks to which they were able to build companies like Samsung and quickly scale, expand their operations, and dominate markets from Europe to North America. But although here is where the explanation of the Korean miracle usually ends, this is a very simplified version of the story, and the whole truth is a lot more complex. Because just a government support doesn't entirely explain how they were able to build massive corporations in technologically advanced sectors and in a country with a little to no industrial or scientific base, and how they were able to catch up and overtake their American and European competitors, which had decades of experience as a head start. Well, a big part of the reason behind this is that South Koreans have mastered the art of the so-called creative imitation, doing what others were doing but better. And at the origin of the South Korea's high-tech industries was its ability to reverse engineer successful Western products and produce similar items but at a higher quality and lower cost. And the reason they were able to do that was because on top of tax breaks and subsidies, the chaebols were able to tap into other crucial resources. Thanks to the state-owned energy company KEPCO, they had access to cheap energy, which lowered their costs. And South Korea's rapidly growing population, which more than doubled between the 1950s and 1980s, together with the country's excellent education education system and its newly created workaholic culture provided an abundance of cheap and qualified labor. Equipped with these advantages, the South Korean chaebols were able to essentially copy and then improve most Western products and offer them at a much lower price, and often in better quality. This allowed the country to eventually move to more advanced products and sectors, evolving from producing textiles and toys to electronics and computers, and also from pure imitation to innovation, gradually improving and perfecting the products that were originally just cheaper copies of their Western competitors. But this is also where the problem began, because this strategy only gets you as far, and it only works as long as you have all the favorable conditions on your side, and as long as you're able to build the stuff at a lower price. But if that changes, you're no longer competitive. And for South Korea, most of the advantages that made it possible gradually went away. After decades of providing energy at subsidized prices to domestic giants, the Korean state-owned energy company KEPCO is now burdened with spiraling debt that has driven it close to bankruptcy. And so the cheap energy that used to fuel South Korea's industry is no longer available. And the cheap and abundant labor is also not a thing anymore, as the country's population is now shrinking rather than growing, and its labor force keeps shrinking along with it. But most importantly, the chaebols, the South Korean industrial giants that drove the country's economy and growth for decades, are no longer the same either. While once upon a time they were hungry predators who pursued growth at every cost, today they're owned by a third generation of their former founders. And according to Professor Park from the Seoul National University, they switched from a former growth mindset, born of hunger, towards an incumbent mindset, born of comfort and complacency instead. In other words, instead of using the government support to pursue aggressive growth, as they used to do, they now use it as a shelter from competition from abroad, and to stifle competition in form of smaller, innovative companies that could take their market share at home. And while they do continue to build high-quality products, the stuff they build today is mostly the same as they used to build 20 or 30 years ago. And while in the 20th century, they managed to grow by expanding into more and more sectors that they would eventually end up dominating in, this hasn't really been happening in the last 20 years anymore. South Korea mostly keeps building new and improved iterations of the same cars, phones, and consumer goods that it produced 20 years ago as well, but it hasn't really been able to expand into any of the fastest growing tech sectors of the past 10 or 20 years. Which is why, in 2012, it led the world in 36 out of 120 priority technologies identified by the Korean government. But in 2020, this has dropped to just 4. And unlike before, they now face a brutal competition from China, which uses a similar strategy as South Korea, and which is increasingly replacing South Korea's former role, and becoming its direct competitor in many of the sectors that South Korea used to dominate. In other words, South Korea is stuck in a model that originated in another time, more than 7 decades ago. And while for a very long time it delivered incredible results, the world has changed, and it just doesn't work anymore. The South Korean government is not able to support the chaebols in the same way as it once did, finding itself without its cheap energy and shrinking population. And meanwhile, the chaebols themselves went from being aggressive predators to bloated corporations that use their unfair advantage to crush domestic competition while they're unable to keep up and break into new sectors and technologies. Now, it might seem like a logical conclusion that this system desperately needs a change. So why is South Korea not trying to do that? Well, the problem is that because of how incredibly successful this model was for a long time, it's now incredibly difficult for South Korea to let it go and move on to something else. The chaebols, with all their influence and wealth, also don't want to change, as that would necessarily mean taking away their unfair privileges. And the fact that South Korea has been stuck in a series of prolonged political crises with a paralyzed political system and an inability to make any strategic strategic decisions as a result doesn't help either. But without significant reform and a willingness to adapt to a new reality, South Korea risks losing its hard-earned place as an economic powerhouse. And the question is whether it will be able to reinvent itself before it's too late.